Arab billionaire CEO ripped black waitress's shirt. Her tattoo stunned everyone in the restaurant. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. The scene was set at a lavish restaurant, the kind where the rich and powerful gathered to flaunt their status. The atmosphere was thick with exclusivity, crystal chandeliers hanging like diamonds from the ceiling, and the sound of soft jazz mixed with the clinking of silverware. At the center of the room sat a group of elites, businessmen who thought the world revolved around them, their power and influence practically radiating from every polished suit. But among them was one woman, a black waitress named Tasha, who, to them, was just another face in the crowd, invisible and insignificant. She moved quietly between tables, her hands steady, her expression calm, but her mind sharp, always aware of the subtle whispers and microaggressions that floated around her. The focus of the evening was an Arab billionaire CEO, Karim al-Mansour, a man whose reputation preceded him like a shadow, known for his ruthless negotiations and unyielding demeanor. His wealth was immeasurable, his ego even more so. As the dinner progressed, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense, with Karim making grand gestures and declarations about his latest ventures, completely ignoring the people around him. Tasha, however, had been serving him and his guests for the evening, quietly doing her job. But she always knew, when the moment would come. It was inevitable in a world like this. Karim, feeling the need to assert his dominance, made a crude remark about Tasha, calling her just a waitress with a smirk. The room fell silent for a moment. But then, with a sharp, dismissive motion, he grabbed the edge of her uniform and ripped part of it. It was a shocking display of arrogance, as if she were nothing more than an object for his amusement. The guests at the table laughed, the sound echoing in Tasha's ears, but she didn't flinch. No one expected her to react. To them, she was just a servant, a worker who was supposed to take their insults in silence. But what happened next would change everything. Tasha stood still for a moment, taking in the sting of the insult. Then, slowly, she turned to face him, her eyes meeting his with a quiet intensity that sent a ripple through the room. She didn't speak a word, but the calm power she exuded was undeniable. She reached up to adjust her uniform, making sure her arm was visible to the room. And then, as the fabric of her sleeve shifted, a large tattoo was revealed on her forearm, an intricate design, a story of strength and resilience. The tattoo was not just a piece of art. It was a symbol of everything she had endured and overcome. As the tattoo became visible, the laughter died down, and the room grew uncomfortably quiet. Karim's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing as he tried to process the change in energy. What he had expected to be a moment of dominance over her had turned into something else entirely. He had no idea who Tasha truly was, and in that instant, he learned the hard way that people are never just what they appear to be. The room was no longer focused on his wealth or his power, but on her quiet strength. The guests shifted uncomfortably, some glancing away, others unsure of how to react. But one thing was clear, Tasha was no longer invisible. She had turned the tables without a single word. Karim, the billionaire who had once thought he could manipulate and degrade anyone in his path, found himself standing before a woman who was far more than he had ever imagined. The power dynamic had shifted in the most unexpected way, and as Tasha continued to stand there, unfazed, the true weight of the situation began to sink in. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with uncertainty and uncomfortable glances. Karim stood frozen, his hand still outstretched from the earlier motion of tearing Tasha's shirt, his face betraying a mix of confusion and a faint sense of humiliation. The laughter that had once filled the room had faded into awkward silence, and all eyes were now on Tasha. Her tattoo, bold and unapologetic, had done more than just shock the guests. It had altered the dynamics of the evening. Tasha, however, didn't react with triumph or anger. She remained still, the quiet power radiating from her, making her presence even more formidable. Karim, for the first time that night, seemed unsure of himself. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure, but his words caught in his throat. The guests at the table exchanged nervous glances, unsure of how to proceed. Some of them shifted uncomfortably in their seats, realizing that the situation had spiraled beyond their control. The conversation had stopped, and now, instead of being the one in control, it was Karim who appeared rattled. He was a man used to dominating every room he entered, but now, standing before Tasha, he was no longer the center of attention. He had underestimated her, and that mistake had cost him. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to apologize, or maybe to try and regain his earlier confidence, but before he could get a word out, Tasha moved. She didn't rush or make any grand gestures. She simply stepped back, her movements smooth and deliberate. With a quiet, confident stride, she walked across the room to a small table by the window, where a young couple had been quietly watching the scene unfold. The man, no older than 30, had noticed Tasha's tattoo earlier and had clearly been moved by her calm defiance. She smiled at them, her expression warm, before she gently placed a glass of wine in front of the woman at the table. The couple exchanged a quick glance before the woman spoke. "I just wanted to say, you're incredible," she said softly, her voice full of admiration. "Thank you." Tasha nodded, her smile never faltering. She didn't need words to express the gratitude that was now coming her way. The gesture wasn't lost on the others in the room. One by one, the guests, who had once laughed at Karim's disrespect, began to shift in their seats, each of them contemplating the shift that had just taken place. Karim, now standing by the head of the table, watched the interaction between Tasha and the couple. His mind raced as he processed the full weight of what had happened. His mind flashed back to the moments before, when he had thought he could humiliate her. He had underestimated her. In the silence that followed, the rest of the room felt the undeniable shift in power. Karim's smug demeanor was gone. He couldn't undo what had been done, and for the first time, he was left vulnerable in front of his peers. It was clear that Tasha had changed the course of the evening. She had, in a way, redefined the power dynamic in the room. Karim had come to the dinner expecting to assert his dominance, but instead, he had been humbled by the very person he thought he could control. He could feel the stares, the silent judgment of his actions from the people around him. The shift was not just in the atmosphere, but in the way people viewed him now. No longer was he the all-powerful CEO. He was the man who had tried to belittle someone who had far more strength than he ever realized. The silence that had followed Tasha's quiet movement was broken only by the soft clinking of glassware, as the weight of the moment settled over everyone. Karim's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his drink, but he couldn't bring himself to take a sip. His eyes were still on Tasha, who now stood near the window, her back to the room, her figure a portrait of quiet strength. The evening, which had begun with his arrogance and dominance, had ended with a humbling reminder of the power that lies in patience, dignity, and the ability to stand one's ground. Tasha, without saying a word, had done what no one else could. She had changed the room, and most importantly, she had changed how they saw her. The wealthy elite had underestimated her, and now, they couldn't ignore her. Karim was no longer the center of attention, Tasha was. The atmosphere in the restaurant had shifted, but the tension remained, as if everyone in the room was holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. Karim Al-Mansour, the once confident billionaire CEO, sat back down at the head of the table, his eyes still locked on Tasha. It was clear he was struggling to regain his composure, and the guests around him seemed just as uneasy. The initial shock of his actions had passed, but the humiliation was far from over. Karim tried to salvage the situation, clearing his throat and offering a half-hearted smile to the room, but the energy had already changed. No longer was he the charismatic leader in control of every conversation. He was the man who had just been publicly put in his place. The silence that filled the room was a far cry from the lively discussions that had taken place just moments before. It was broken only by the occasional clink of glassware or the soft rustle of someone shifting in their seat. Tasha, still standing near the window, was the center of attention now, though she remained calm and collected, as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. She continued to move between tables, gracefully offering refills and adjusting the settings with a quiet dignity. Her actions spoke volumes, though she said nothing. It was almost as if she was daring the room to recognize her power, not the kind that came from wealth, but the kind that came from self-respect and resilience. As the dinner went on, Karim couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed irrevocably. His mind raced, replaying the moments leading up to his mistake. He had underestimated Tasha, had dismissed her as just another waitress, another face in the crowd. But now, as he watched her move through the restaurant with such grace and poise, he couldn't help but wonder if he had made a fatal error in judgment. He had seen the look in her eyes when she had turned to face him after he ripped her shirt, and in that moment, he realized she was not someone to be trifled with. He was a man used to people bending to his will, but Tasha had stood firm, refusing to be intimidated. The guests at the table, who had initially laughed at Karim's actions, were now silent, their eyes flicking between Tasha and the billionaire. Some were clearly uncomfortable, others seemed to feel the weight of the moment. Karim shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his fingers drumming lightly on the edge of the table, but no one spoke. The hum of conversation had died down, and what remained was a quiet tension that only grew stronger with each passing second. Just as Karim opened his mouth to speak, to make some sort of attempt at regaining his dignity, a voice interrupted him. It was one of the guests, a woman in her 50s, who had been watching the scene unfold from across the room. She spoke softly but firmly, her words cutting through the silence like a knife. "You've made a fool of yourself tonight," she said, looking directly at Karim. The words hung in the air, and for the first time, Karim felt the sting of being truly seen for what he was. The woman continued, her voice unwavering. "She didn't need to say anything to show you up. You did it all on your own." Karim's face reddened, his jaw tightening as he clenched his fists under the table. The woman had hit the mark, and everyone in the room knew it. The moment that had started with his arrogance and sense of superiority had turned into something else entirely. Tasha had done nothing except remain calm, but she had won the respect of the entire room. Her silence had spoken louder than any words could have. Karim realized then that true power was not about domination or control. It was about strength of character, the ability to stand tall in the face of adversity, and the wisdom to know when to remain silent. It was something he had never truly understood until now. He sat back in his chair, his mind racing. This wasn't just a failed dinner negotiation. It was a lesson, one that he hadn't asked for but desperately needed. The woman he had tried to humiliate had taught him more in a few moments than he had learned in a lifetime of business dealings. The dinner continued, but for Karim, it was no longer about the deal, the power, or the wealth. It was about his own ego, which had been shattered in front of the people he thought he could control. As the evening wore on, Tasha's influence in the room only grew. The respect she had earned from her quiet defiance was impossible to ignore. Karim, for the first time, found himself humbled, and as the night came to a close, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just lost more than a business deal. He had lost his sense of self, his arrogance, and perhaps the very thing that had made him who he was. As the evening came to a close, the atmosphere in the restaurant had changed. What had started as a high-stakes dinner meeting had turned into something more profound, a moment of reflection for everyone involved. Karim Al-Mansour sat at the table, his mind swirling with thoughts, none of which seemed to make sense anymore. The guests, who had once looked up to him, now seemed distant, unsure of how to act around him. His usual charisma, the power he wielded so effortlessly, had all but evaporated. He had been humbled, not just by Tasha's calm presence, but by the events that had unfolded so unexpectedly. The moment when he had tried to dominate her had instead been the moment when he had lost control. The power he thought he had over people had been exposed as fragile, built on arrogance and disrespect. The silence that followed Tasha's actions weighed heavily on the room. It was as if the entire evening had been a lesson in humility, and Karim was the one being taught. The guests, who had once been eager to engage in conversation with him, now avoided his gaze, some stealing glances at Tasha, still moving gracefully between tables. Karim shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands clasped together in front of him as he stared down at the polished table. He wasn't sure what to do next, what words to say, or how to repair the damage. He had thought he could break her spirit with a simple gesture, but it was his own spirit that had been fractured. The evening had taken a turn that no one had expected, least of all him. As the night continued, a strange sense of clarity began to settle over Karim. He realized he was no longer in control of the situation, and for the first time in a long while, he found himself feeling powerless. Tasha, the woman he had belittled, had become the source of strength in the room. She hadn't needed to fight back with anger or words. Her calm and composed demeanor had done all the talking for her. She had shown him that true power wasn't in the money, the status, or the ability to dominate others. It was in the ability to hold one's ground with dignity, to stand up for oneself without needing to tear others down. This realization hit Karim like a ton of bricks. He had spent his entire life climbing the corporate ladder, accumulating wealth, and making deals, but in all of that, he had lost sight of what truly mattered: respect, empathy, and humility. Tasha had reminded him of this, in the most unexpected way possible. As the dinner wound down, Karim's thoughts were interrupted by one of the other guests, a man in his 40s, who leaned over to him and whispered, "You've got to fix this." It wasn't an accusation, but more of a suggestion, a gentle push. The man had witnessed the entire exchange and knew what was at stake. Karim had no choice but to acknowledge the truth. The damage had been done, but perhaps, just perhaps, he could do something to make things right. As the guests began to filter out of the restaurant, Karim stood up and walked toward Tasha, who was busy clearing the table at the far end of the room. He approached her slowly, his footsteps echoing in the now empty space. Tasha looked up as he drew near, her expression unreadable, but there was no sign of anger or bitterness in her eyes. She simply met his gaze, waiting. Karim took a deep breath before speaking, his voice low and sincere. "I owe you an apology," he said, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. "What I did was wrong, and I should never have treated you the way I did." Tasha didn't respond immediately. She simply stood there, her eyes steady, and for a moment, it seemed as if she were weighing his words carefully. Finally, she nodded, just slightly, acknowledging the apology. "It's not about the apology," she said softly, her voice calm but firm. "It's about respect. You've got to understand that, and maybe then you'll learn something valuable." Karim was silent for a moment, absorbing her words. He could feel the weight of what she had just said. It wasn't just an apology that he needed to offer. It was a change in perspective, a shift in how he viewed the world and the people around him. As he stood there, staring into her eyes, he realized that Tasha was right. The power he had always thought he wielded was nothing compared to the quiet strength she had shown that night. With a final nod, he turned and walked toward the exit, but something had changed. He wasn't the same man who had entered that restaurant hours earlier. He had been forced to confront his own arrogance and entitlement, and while it was painful, it was also necessary. He now understood that true strength comes from humility, and perhaps this night had been a wake-up call he never knew he needed. The next few days, after the dinner, were strange for Karim. He could not shake the feeling that something profound had shifted inside him. The dinner had been a turning point, not just in his professional life, but in his personal understanding of power, respect, and the way he interacted with the world. He had always been someone who believed that money and status were the ultimate tools for control. But now, he saw the cracks in that belief, the cracks that had been exposed by someone he had considered beneath him. Tasha's words lingered in his mind, especially the way she had said, "It's about respect." He couldn't stop thinking about how easily he had dismissed her, assuming that a simple gesture of aggression would break her. But it hadn't. Instead, it had been his own arrogance that had broken. As the days passed, Karim began to make small but significant changes. He started paying more attention to the people around him, not just the ones who held power or influence, but the ones he had once dismissed, the waitstaff, the drivers, the people in the offices he had never noticed. He realized that in all his years of climbing the corporate ladder, he had never truly seen them. He had only seen people as tools, things to be used and discarded when they no longer served a purpose. But now, that way of thinking seemed wrong, even cruel. It wasn't long before Karim found himself at another event, one of the many networking dinners he regularly attended. This time, however, he walked into the room with a different mindset. Instead of his usual domineering presence, he approached the event with a sense of humility, almost as if he were a newcomer in his own world. He greeted the waitstaff with a smile, made small talk with the bartenders, and even shared a laugh with the chefs in the kitchen. For the first time in his career, he wasn't the center of attention. He was just a man, trying to make amends for the things he had done wrong. It was in the midst of this event that he saw Tasha again. She was moving gracefully between the tables, her presence as strong as ever. But this time, he didn't look at her as the woman he had humiliated. He saw her as someone who had taught him a lesson he would never forget. Karim approached her slowly, the noise of the crowd fading as he drew closer. Tasha looked up as he neared, and for a brief moment, their eyes locked. There was no hostility in her gaze, only a quiet understanding. Karim felt a rush of emotion he hadn't expected. He had expected an apology, a chance to make things right. But Tasha had already moved past that. She didn't need an apology from him. She had already shown him what true strength was. Tasha, he began, his voice steady but sincere. I've been thinking a lot about what happened that night. I want you to know that I understand now. You were right. Everything I thought I knew about power was wrong. Tasha didn't say anything at first. She simply nodded, her expression softening. Karim continued, I was arrogant, and I treated you in a way that no one should ever be treated. I've learned from that mistake. And I hope that somehow, I can make it up to you. For a moment, Tasha just looked at him, and Karim felt a weight in the silence between them. He wasn't sure what he expected, but he wasn't expecting what happened next. Tasha gave him a small smile, one that didn't carry any bitterness, only a quiet, knowing strength. You don't need to make it up to me, she said softly. You've already learned the most important lesson. Karim felt a pang of gratitude, mixed with a little disbelief. He had expected some sort of grand gesture of forgiveness, but instead, he had received something far more meaningful, recognition of his growth. It wasn't about the apology. It wasn't about making amends for the past. It was about what he had learned and how he would change going forward. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Tasha simply nodded again before turning back to her duties. But as she walked away, Karim stood there, watching her. He realized that in that moment, she had become more than just the woman who had humbled him. She had become a symbol of everything he aspired to be, a person who was unshakable, a person who didn't need to prove anything to anyone, someone whose strength came not from dominance, but from integrity. As he watched her move through the room, Karim couldn't help but feel a deep sense of respect for her, not just as a waitress, but as someone who had shown him the true meaning of power. A few weeks later, as the deal that had once been the focus of that dinner came to fruition, Karim made a decision. He invited Tasha to join him and his team for a meeting. It wasn't just a business meeting. It was his way of acknowledging her role in his transformation. And though it was a small gesture, it was the first of many steps he would take to ensure that he would never forget the lesson she had taught him. Power, he had learned, didn't come from money or status. It came from respect, humility, and the strength to be unapologetically yourself. In the weeks that followed, Karim's transformation was gradual but undeniable. His behavior had shifted, and so had the way people responded to him. At the next corporate meeting, he stood before his colleagues, no longer the arrogant leader they had come to expect, but someone who was listening more, who was paying attention not just to the numbers, but to the people around him. It was a quiet change, but it spoke volumes. Karim had spent so many years being focused solely on the success of his company, on the growth of his fortune, that he had never realized the true impact of his actions on others. Tasha had unknowingly made him see the value in humility, in understanding, and in treating everyone with respect, no matter their position. The shift was not without its challenges, however. Karim still had moments when the old habits crept back in. There were still days when he caught himself getting frustrated with the slow pace of change, or feeling tempted to revert to his old ways of dominating the room. But each time he felt that pull, he reminded himself of the lesson Tasha had taught him. He had learned the hard way that power gained through fear and manipulation was fragile, but power built on respect and genuine human connection was unshakable. One day, not long after the dinner, Karim found himself on a call with one of his top investors, a man who was known for being tough and demanding. The conversation started like any other, with talk of market trends, new acquisitions, and potential business moves. But as the conversation wore on, Karim could feel the tone shift. The investor, used to getting his way, was pushing Karim harder than usual, expecting him to bend and agree to terms that didn't feel right. In the past, Karim would have given in, caving to the pressure in order to maintain the deal. But this time, something was different. He listened to the investor's demands, considered the implications, and instead of simply agreeing, he responded with a firm but respectful counteroffer. "I understand your position," Karim said, his voice steady. "But I think we need to look at this differently. Let's work together to find a solution that works for both of us. I'm not willing to make a decision that could harm either of our interests." The investor paused. There was a long silence on the other end of the line before he spoke again, his tone softer now. "You've changed, Karim," he said. "I've never heard you speak like this before. Maybe you're right. Let's revisit the terms." The conversation ended on a positive note, and Karim felt a sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with a signed contract or a closed deal. It was the first time he had stood his ground without losing his integrity, and it felt like a victory. As the days turned into weeks, Karim continued to reflect on his newfound approach to leadership. It wasn't just about making better business decisions. It was about being a better person. He made a point to reach out to people he had previously overlooked, employees at every level, from the interns in the office to the drivers who brought him to meetings. He wanted to understand their perspectives, to see the world through their eyes, and to show them the respect they deserved. It wasn't always easy, but he was determined to change. One afternoon, he received an email invitation for another corporate gala, one he had attended countless times before. In the past, these events had been opportunities to network, to flaunt his success, and to make deals. But this time, the thought of the event made him feel uneasy. He had no desire to return to the old patterns of self-promotion and arrogance. Instead, he decided to invite Tasha, as a gesture of respect and gratitude for the role she had played in his transformation. It was a small gesture, but it meant something to him. When the night of the gala arrived, Karim and Tasha walked into the ballroom together. People looked at them, curious, but they didn't care. This wasn't about making an impression or proving something to others. This was about acknowledging the value of those who had always been in the background, the ones who had been overlooked. As they walked through the room, Karim couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had come a long way from the man who had once tried to break Tasha with a simple gesture of disrespect. Now, he stood beside her, not as a superior, but as someone who had learned the true meaning of power. As the evening went on, people approached them, some with polite greetings, others with questions about business. But Karim noticed something. There was a shift in how they interacted with him. People were more genuine, more respectful. He had earned their respect, not through money or status, but through the way he had changed, the way he treated others. Later that evening, Karim pulled Tasha aside. He looked at her, grateful for the impact she had had on his life. "Thank you," he said. "You've done more for me than anyone else ever has. I don't think I would have gotten here without you." Tasha smiled, her eyes filled with a quiet understanding. "It wasn't me, Karim," she said. "It was always within you. You just needed to see it for yourself." As time went on, the changes in Karim became more apparent. His colleagues, and even those who had once been skeptical about his transformation, began to notice the shift in his leadership style. Where there had once been a sense of fear and intimidation, there was now an atmosphere of collaboration and mutual respect. Karim had not only embraced the lessons Tasha had taught him, but he was actively applying them in every aspect of his life, from his business dealings to his personal relationships. One afternoon, as Karim sat in his office reflecting on the progress he had made, a thought crossed his mind. He had spent so many years striving for success, believing that financial growth and status would bring him fulfillment. But now, he realized that true success wasn't measured by how much money he made or how many deals he closed. It was measured by the impact he had on others, by the respect he earned, and by the positive changes he inspired in the world around him. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on his office door. It was his assistant, who handed him an envelope with a letter inside. Karim opened it and saw that it was from Tasha. He hadn't expected to hear from her in this way, but as he read her words, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. The letter was simple, but its message was powerful. Tasha thanked him for his kindness and for showing her that people could change. She acknowledged the impact he had made not only in his business, but in her own life as well. She had seen his growth firsthand, and she believed that his transformation could inspire others to do the same. Karim felt a lump form in his throat as he finished reading the letter. It wasn't just an apology or a simple thank you. It was a testament to the fact that Tasha's belief in him had never wavered. She had always seen his potential, even when he couldn't see it himself. He knew, in that moment, that he owed her so much more than a simple thank you. He owed her the commitment to continue growing, to continue learning, and to never fall back into the patterns of arrogance that had once defined him. Over the next few weeks, Karim took steps to further solidify the changes he had made. He made a point to spend more time with his employees, engaging with them on a personal level, asking about their lives and their ideas. He wanted to ensure that everyone at his company felt valued, regardless of their position. He also sought out opportunities to mentor younger leaders, sharing with them the lessons he had learned and encouraging them to lead with integrity and empathy. The results were immediate. The company culture began to shift in ways Karim had never imagined. Employees were more motivated, more loyal, and more willing to go above and beyond for the company. Productivity soared, and with it, profits followed. But Karim knew that the real success wasn't in the numbers. It was in the way people treated each other, the way they respected one another, and the way they all worked together towards a common goal. One day, while attending another corporate event, Karim found himself in a conversation with an old colleague, someone who had known him during his more arrogant days. The colleague was clearly surprised by the change in him, commenting on how different he seemed. Karim smiled, realizing that the change wasn't just something he had noticed, it was something everyone had noticed. "I've learned a lot over the past few months," Karim said, his voice steady. "Sometimes, it takes a wake-up call to realize that the things you thought mattered the most aren't the things that truly make a difference. It's about how you treat people. It's about respect." His colleague nodded, clearly impressed. "I can see that," he said. "And I have to say, it's inspiring to see someone make such a big shift. It's not easy to admit when you're wrong and change your ways." Karim nodded, acknowledging the truth in his words. "It wasn't easy," he admitted, "but it was necessary. I've learned that power isn't about control or money. It's about understanding, humility, and leading by example." As the conversation ended and the event continued, Karim found himself reflecting on how far he had come. It hadn't been an easy journey, but it had been one of the most rewarding of his life. He had learned to embrace change, to admit his mistakes, and to lead with a sense of purpose that went beyond profit. The true power, he had discovered, lay in lifting others up, not in tearing them down. And as he looked around the room, seeing people engaged in meaningful conversations and working together, he realized that the future was brighter than ever. His legacy would not be defined by the deals he closed or the wealth he amassed, but by the impact he had on the people he worked with, the lessons he had taught, and the respect he had earned. Months passed, and Karim's transformation continued to unfold, though now it felt more natural than forced. He no longer saw himself as the untouchable CEO who controlled everything from the boardroom to the dinner table. His perspective on leadership had completely shifted, and it was evident in the way he interacted with others. People at his company began to look at him differently, not just as a figure of authority, but as someone who truly cared about their well-being and development. One afternoon, as Karim sat in his office preparing for an upcoming board meeting, his assistant handed him a thick folder. Inside was a proposal for a new business venture, one that was risky but had the potential for huge rewards. It was exactly the type of deal Karim had once jumped at without hesitation. But as he looked over the details, something felt different. His first instinct wasn't to act quickly, to push the deal through regardless of the potential fallout. Instead, he took a deep breath and called a meeting with his team. The conference room was filled with the usual faces, his trusted managers, analysts, and a few key investors. As they went over the numbers and projections, Karim couldn't help but notice how much he valued their input now. In the past, he had been the one calling all the shots, making decisions alone. Now, he found himself genuinely listening to their perspectives, valuing their expertise, and encouraging open dialogue. "I think we need to approach this deal differently," Karim said, his voice calm but firm. "We can't just think about the short-term profits. We need to consider the long-term impact on our employees, our partners, and the communities we serve." There was a brief silence around the table, and for a moment, Karim wondered if his colleagues would question his shift in approach. But instead, one of the senior managers, Sarah, spoke up. "I agree," she said. "I've seen how much the company has changed over the past few months. And I think this could be an opportunity for us to build something even more meaningful. We don't just want to make money. We want to make a difference." Karim smiled, feeling a sense of pride in his team. This wasn't just about numbers anymore. It was about creating something sustainable, something that would leave a positive legacy. They spent the next few hours discussing how they could tweak the proposal to align more closely with their new values. By the end of the meeting, they had developed a strategy that not only protected their financial interests, but also prioritized the well-being of their people and the environment. As the meeting adjourned, Karim felt a weight lift off his shoulders. This was the kind of leadership he had been striving for, a leadership that wasn't driven by fear or ego, but by a genuine desire to make a positive impact. Later that evening, as he sat alone in his office reflecting on the day, Karim's phone buzzed. It was a message from Tasha. It simply read, "I heard about the changes you've been making. I'm proud of you." Karim smiled, feeling a rush of gratitude. He had come so far since that fateful dinner, and while the journey was far from over, he knew he was on the right path. The next morning, Karim invited Tasha to his office. He wanted to thank her in person for everything she had done, for showing him the value of humility, respect, and kindness. When she arrived, he greeted her with a warm smile and led her to a chair across from his desk. "I don't think I'll ever be able to thank you enough for what you've done for me," Karim began, his voice sincere. "You changed the way I see the world, and I owe you so much for that." Tasha smiled, her eyes soft but knowing. "I didn't change you, Karim," she said. "You just needed to see it in yourself. You've always had it in you. You just needed the right push." Karim felt a wave of emotion wash over him. It was true. The changes he had made weren't because of her direct influence. They were the result of his own self-reflection, his willingness to grow, and his commitment to doing better. Tasha had simply given him the perspective he needed. "I'll keep working on it," Karim said, his voice steady. "And I'll make sure that what I've learned isn't just something I keep to myself. I want everyone I work with to see the same thing I've learned, to treat people with respect, to value integrity over profit, and to always lead with kindness." Tasha nodded. "That's all anyone can do. Lead by example." As they continued to talk, Karim felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The road he had taken was difficult, but it had led him to a place of clarity. He wasn't the same man who had walked into that restaurant months ago. He was someone who had learned that true power came not from wealth or status, but from the ability to lift others up, to treat them with dignity, and to lead with compassion. As the conversation came to an end, Karim felt a renewed sense of purpose. He was no longer just a CEO. He was a leader in the truest sense of the word. And as he walked Tasha out of his office, he couldn't help but feel grateful for the unexpected lessons she had taught him. Karim was ready for the future, not just as a businessman, but as someone who truly understood the power of respect and humility. As the months continued to unfold, the changes that had taken place in Karim became not only visible to those around him, but also deeply ingrained within himself. The respect he had earned from his employees, partners, and even those who had once doubted him, was a constant reminder of the shift he had undergone. His leadership style, once driven by ego and power, had transformed into one rooted in empathy, collaboration, and integrity. Karim found himself at peace in ways he had never experienced before. He no longer defined his worth by his bank account or the size of his empire. Instead, his value came from how he treated others, how he inspired growth, and how he led with purpose. It wasn't always easy. There were days when the old habits crept back in, when the pressure of the business world made him want to revert to the comfort of his old ways. But every time he felt the temptation to fall back into arrogance, he remembered Tasha, the lessons she had unknowingly taught him, and the person he had become because of her. He realized that power, true power, was not in control or manipulation, but in the ability to uplift others, to see the potential in people that they couldn't see in themselves. One afternoon, Karim sat in a meeting with a group of potential investors, preparing for a high-stakes deal that could expand his company even further. The old Karim might have been focused solely on the numbers, on the bottom line. But this time, he found himself more concerned with how the deal would impact the lives of the people who worked for him and the communities they served. As the investors pitched their vision, Karim listened intently, not only to their words, but also to the energy in the room. He could sense the subtle manipulations, the rush to close the deal without truly considering the consequences. He knew that if he moved forward with the deal as it was, it could lead to short-term gains. But at what cost? After a moment of contemplation, Karim spoke up. "I hear your projections, and I see the numbers. But what I'm also hearing is a rush to profit without a clear understanding of what it means for the people who will be most affected by this deal. I won't make a decision based solely on financial return. We need to create something sustainable, something that doesn't just benefit the bottom line, but also improves the lives of the people involved. The room fell silent. Karim could feel the tension, the skepticism from some of the investors. But then, one of them, a woman in her late 40s, nodded thoughtfully. "You're right," she said, her voice calm. "I respect that. Let's take a step back and look at this from a different perspective." The conversation shifted, and by the end of the meeting, they had devised a plan that satisfied both the financial goals and the ethical considerations. Karim felt a sense of pride that was far deeper than the thrill of closing a deal. It was a sense of purpose, knowing that his company was growing in a way that aligned with his new values. Over time, Karim's transformation became a model for others in the industry. His company flourished not just because of its financial success, but because it became a place where people felt valued, where the focus was not just on numbers, but on building relationships, on creating opportunities for growth, and on doing business with integrity. People wanted to work with him, not because of his wealth, but because of the respect he had earned. As the years went by, Karim became known not only as a successful entrepreneur, but also as a mentor to others in his field. He took young leaders under his wing, teaching them the lessons he had learned the hard way. He shared his story with them, not to boast of his success, but to show them that true leadership came from humility, from the ability to listen, and from the courage to change when necessary. One day, as Karim was attending an industry conference, he was approached by a former employee who had left the company years ago. The employee, now successful in his own right, came up to Karim with a smile. "I just wanted to thank you," he said. "The way you changed the company, the way you led, it had a huge impact on me. I took those lessons with me, and I use them every day in my own business." Karim smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. It was moments like this that made all the struggles, all the challenges, worth it. He had spent so many years trying to prove his worth through money and success, but now, he knew that the true measure of his success was in the lives he had touched, the people he had helped, and the legacy he was building. That night, as he reflected on the path he had taken, Karim thought back to that fateful dinner, the moment when everything had changed. He had been humiliated, yes, but he had also been given the gift of self-awareness, a gift that had allowed him to grow into the person he had always been capable of becoming. He had learned that real power was not about control or dominance. It was about respect, understanding, and the courage to lead with integrity. Karim had finally become the man he had always wanted to be, and it wasn't because of his wealth or his empire. It was because he had learned to lead with his heart. In this captivating journey, one man's transformation from arrogance to humility unfolds, proving that true power comes from respect and understanding. The story dives deep into the complex dynamics of leadership, emphasizing how personal growth can shape a person's future. Follow along as we explore the powerful lessons learned through a series of events, starting from a humiliating encounter and leading to a powerful realization. As Karim, a successful businessman, navigates through his own challenges, he discovers what it truly means to lead with integrity. This is not just a business story, but a powerful example of how human connections and respect can change lives. Through his journey, Karim becomes a model for others, showcasing how a person can evolve when they embrace empathy and kindness. This is one of the many Black stories that reveal the strength of character, the importance of humility, and the impact of personal growth. The transformation Karim goes through teaches us that true leadership is not about control, but about lifting others up and making decisions with integrity. His story serves as a reminder that even those who seem to have everything can find a deeper sense of purpose when they begin to see the value in others. In a world focused on profit and success, this Black story stands out as a beacon of hope, proving that when we respect each other, we can build something far greater than just wealth. This is one of the Black stories that inspire us to be better, to lead with grace, and to never forget the power of listening and learning from those around us. Karim's journey is a testament to the idea that when we take the time to reflect and grow, we can create lasting change that impacts not only our own lives, but the lives of others as well.